Greetings, everybody. What's up? This is Laymentality, Kyle and Matt, as usual, behind the microphones. So we're doing an intro to an intro. We actually had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski and pick his brain a little bit. And so I guess Matt and I wanted to do an intro into this interview for a couple reasons. And you'll hear actually a few of those reasons in the interview. So to set this up, in talking with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, we really, wanted to question him about the traditional movement, which he is just well versed upon. And the talk that he gave at a Novus Ordo parish here in our area. And just, what are some of the differences? What are some of the things that people who go to traditional mass, what are some of the mistakes they make in looking at people at the new mass and vice versa? And so I just wanted to say, when listening to this talk, if you hear some things that make you have pause or maybe rub you the wrong way, I would just ask that you prayerfully sit with that and really think about, are you offended because it offends God or it takes reverence away from God? Or are you offended because maybe on a personal note, you feel offended from a personal place, and really decide if it's from a personal place, should you maybe just continue to try to prayerfully discern and judge it on the merits, not so much on the emotion.
Yeah. And I would just encourage everyone to listen with an open heart to what's said, and try to put any preconceived ideas aside for the time being, because I think that a lot of the information that was shared by Dr. Kwasniewski is extremely valuable, and it would be a shame if any of us listening would miss some of the really beautiful things he's sharing about our Catholic faith because we're so jaded by whatever preconceived ideas we might have about one thing or the other. And I think, Kyle, it might be beneficial to define a few terms for people before we get into this interview, because I can imagine a lot of people who are listening may not be super familiar with certain terms, such as the difference. Yeah, the Tridentine Mass, what is the Novus Ordo versus the traditional? So just a kind of very brief overview, we're talking a lot about the differences between the traditional Mass and the Novus Ordo Mass. So the traditional Mass can also be referred to as the Latin Mass or the extraordinary form of the Mass or the Tridentine Mass. All these terms are the same thing. And it's basically the form of Mass that you do not see very often anymore, but before the Second Vatican Council, you would have seen only this form of the Mass going back into, I want to say the early 4th century or something like that. Dr. Kwasniewski said something about it. Yeah. And then the form of Mass that most of us are familiar with now is called the ordinary form or the Novus Ordo. And it's what you see on any given Sunday when you go to Mass, unless typically if you're going to a traditional Latin Mass, you know that you're going to traditional Latin Mass. Yeah. If your Mass is in English, then you are not going to a Latin Mass. That should be pretty easy. If your Mass is in your vernacular, if it's in your tongue, then most likely it's the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, the ordinary form, like Matt had alluded to. So no, that's a great point, because, that does get used synonymously, where you'll hear the extraordinary form or the Latin Mass or the Tridentine Mass or the new Mass, the Novus Ordo. And if you're not familiar that those are kind of synonymous terms with each other, you might scratch your head and be like, holy cow, how many different masses are we talking about here? So exactly. Yeah. So in this interview, we're talking about two different kind of masses. We use a lot of different terms to refer to those two different kind of masses. And the change that took place that we talk about at several points throughout this took place at the Second Vatican Council. So basically from the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council till today, these changes in the Mass have unfolded. Correct. And so without any further ado, we're going to go ahead and segue into this interview and look at Laymentality. Matt and I talk a lot about how,
growing in your faith and learning your faith and knowing church history and all those things. And so we really try to toe that line.
Yeah, exactly. So we hope everyone enjoys this. If you disagree with anything that you hear, we ask you to reach out to us, tell us. We would love to hear your thoughts, opinions, anything like that.
And I would say, even if you don't disagree, even if you have questions, or if you do agree, we want to hear, because I think that also there's a lot of people who go to the new mass who kind of probably would like to have at least an option of a traditional mass as well. So I think that whether you disagree or you agree, or you're like, oh, this was awesome, or it wasn't, I think like Matt's saying, let's just get a conversation started. Let's get some dialogue going.
How long is this intro? This is going to be as long as the interview itself. Let's get it started.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Laymentality. It is Kyle and Matt as usual, and today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. He's a theologian, a philosopher, a composer of sacred music, writer, blogger, editor, publisher, and public speaker, a father, a husband, a world traveler, a great beautiful singer. It might be easier for me to say what he is not at this point. So Dr. Kwasniewski, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much.
So we just want to have a conversation with you, pick your brain a little bit. And so I want to turn it over to Matt, because I know that whenever we first brought up that we were going to be talking with you, he already kind of had some questions. And I think that maybe this might happen. Do you think you're controversial maybe in the Catholic world?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Okay, fair enough. Jesus was controversial, right?
Yeah, so Dr. Kwasniewski, thank you so much for talking to us today. And I have a confession to make. Before Kyle told me that we were going to be interviewing you, I didn't actually know anything about you. And so when he told me that we were going to be interviewing you, he mentioned that you were a traditional Catholic. And as soon as he said the word traditional Catholic, in my mind, I cringed a little bit, because immediately I thought of as Dom Alcuin Reed said in his talk today, the liturgy wars that are being waged during in today's Catholic society. And so it just brought to mind some negative connotations that go along with all of that. Fortunately, I looked into who you are and some of the things you've written and some of the talks that you've given, and I found that after some research, I'm actually very excited to talk to you, because I think you bring a very measured approach that's needed in today's climate in the Catholic Church. But one of the things I wanted to ask you to get started was how, given the identity politics that are so prevalent in today's society, how can we try to speak truth through the bickering and the back and forth and the hiding behind a computer screen that shapes so many people's thoughts about traditional Catholic Mass versus Novus Ordo?
Yes, it's a good question. Unfortunately, social media has definitely unleashed all of the worst habits, as you mentioned, people hiding behind a screen. And I think, frankly, there's a lot of confusion out there in the world. There's a lot of bitterness. Catholics very often feel betrayed by the shepherds in the church. They even feel betrayed by the chief shepherd in the church. And so I think there's also just a lot of anxiety, angst, fear, and bewilderment. And then on top of all of that, there are so many deep disagreements among Catholics, among faithful Catholics, people who really want to live, the life of the faith. And the internet has kind of intensified that by bringing it all out on the same level. It's like everything is out there. You can find anything within 3 clicks. And then also I just think it's true that there are many subjects that are difficult to talk about, and the liturgical reform, what happened in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it requires a lot of study. I've been studying this for 30 years, and there are people who make quick judgments, snap judgments. They shoot from the hip. They make ridiculous statements either about the traditional Mass or about the Novus Ordo Mass. For example, the people who say, "Oh, you mean the clowns and guitar Mass?" Well, not every Novus Ordo Mass looks that way, although probably too many of them do. And then you hear people talk about, that traditional Catholics, they're so uptight and joyless and pharisaical, and all these caricatures, which I think are caricatures. Sometimes a caricature is true, but I mean, for the most part, the Catholics I know who go to the fraternity chapels, the institute chapels, they're just good, solid, faithful people, and they love the beauty and they love the reverence and the idea of being connected with centuries of other worshipers in these really rich prayers that that reward patient, repeated use and study. So I think we have to, number one, we have to get over the caricatures. We have to get over the stereotypes. Number two, we have to assume the best intentions of people. And I really work on this with myself. Most people don't understand enough about the history of the liturgy and the liturgical reform to really be able to, well, let me put it this way. If somebody goes to the Novus Ordo, chances are it's because that's all they've ever known. Or even if they know that there's another alternative, they've never given it really a chance. Or they can't seriously think about going to a liturgy that's in a foreign language. So there are these very basic barriers, and we shouldn't assume bad will of them. You're like, oh, these people are so stubborn. Why can't they get their acts together? Because, well, maybe they haven't been given the grace that somebody else has been given, or so anyway, that's
yeah. And do you think that part of it too is that within the new Mass, there's also an emotional connection? Because, for example, if and I know that this comes up, but if there's a dad and he's doting over his daughter because he's super proud that she's an altar server, right? And so it's almost like not only does it come to liturgical or things like that, but there's also an emotional connection. And we could say that, is it, again, that goes back to the point, are we going for a God or for a feeling or so, that's what I think that, and that's what makes it tough too, is that if the emotions could be shelved,
yes,
then could we further that dialogue between the two factions, as we would call it, to say, hey, we should be aiming for the same goal here.
Yes, it's true. And I mean, and it's unfortunate and really, really, truly sad that the way the liturgy has been celebrated in so many churches throughout the Western world for the past several decades has led to the situation that Ratzinger talks about as the closed circle. People who are going to church in a sense to celebrate the community, and because it gives them some kind of either warm fuzzy or because it makes them feel good about themselves, like I'm fulfilling my obligation, which is true. It's a good thing to fulfill one's obligations, but not the sense of I'm going there for an encounter with the transcendent mystery of God revealed, but still veiled in Christ. That is, there's a sense when you go to a more traditional form of worship that your whole horizon is being burst open to eternity. And you're looking, in a sense, farther than the eye can see, and you're all oriented outside of yourselves to God. That's very important, and a lot of people have never experienced worship like that. So it's almost as if they can't understand what the traditional Catholics are saying, and often the traditional Catholics are not very talented at putting it into words. What is it that you're missing, and what could you get? You could actually get more out of this. You'd be a more fulfilled, a more holistic Catholic if you could go to this and get and experience it. But oftentimes that just ends up coming across as, holier than thou, like you're not as good as we are because you don't use Latin, you don't use chant, you don't have incense. And I don't think people want to say we're better than you are. Often, in fact, at least in my experience, I've become more aware of how much of a sinner I am by going to the traditional liturgy, because it kind of forces you to look at certain things that are difficult. And so I think internally people don't feel that way, but it comes across that way.
Sure.
So Kyle has on several occasions invited me to attend a traditional liturgy with him, and I've declined every invitation.
Not today.
Except for today. Yeah, you got me. And Kyle mentioned emotions, and the emotion that kept me from ever attending a traditional liturgy was the emotion of fear. And that was fear because I recognize even in the Novus Ordo setting where there's not so much silence. I have 3 children and my 2-year-old. daughter is going through a stage right now. She was just potty trained, and she likes to tell everyone that she has to go poopy in the middle of Mass. And when I try to tell her, please be quiet, like, please just don't say that right now, she thinks I didn't hear her. And so she proceeds to say it even louder. And so that, recognizing her behavior and then trying to picture myself sitting in a longer, quieter service is scary, to say the least. So what would you say to encourage somebody like me who is struggling with that, to encourage me to take that chance and go to a more traditional liturgy?
Yes, it's a great question. I mean, and actually, if you go to a thriving parish run by the Fraternity of St. Peter, for example, I mean, they're or the Institute of Christ the King, you find so many families there with so many little kids that it can often be fairly riotous. The background noise it's not, I mean, it's quiet in the sense that there's a reverential atmosphere, but it's definitely not pin drop quiet. And many other parents are struggling with exactly the same issues. I mean, of course, when my children were small, my wife and I basically had to tag team. And that's what, you always go back and forth, and probably half the time somebody can be out in the atrium of the church, walking the child until he or she stops crying or whatever it might be. But I think in my experience, people have a ton of understanding for that. That is to say, they love seeing the children. Most people, every once in a while, there's a grumpy person who's like, gives you the evil eye. But I mean, for the most part, people just appreciate that. As a friend said to me, a church is either dying or crying.
That's right. That's right. That's a great line, because it's true. And I think that also too, people who maybe when they go into like a Tridentine Mass, they think that everybody there is just super rigid.
Yeah.
It's actually a very loving, welcoming place. And there's a lot of babies there and people in the same position, to where it's almost like, hey, you're among many of us who are going to have crying babies. Very accepting. But no, that's a great point, because I think that's a fear, right? They're like, wait a minute, silence?
But the other thing I want to add too, and I saw this not only as a parent, but I see it in many other families, that initially it can be difficult for the little children to get used to the quiet and the expectations of more disciplined behavior. But over time, they actually become habituated to it, and they know that the church is the place to be quiet. And so it has, ultimately, if you persevere, it can make it easier to deal with children in church, because sometimes when they're at a Mass where there's more noise and more going on, they feel more spontaneously free to express themselves. And there isn't such a sense of like, oh, this is the hush hush place, So I think that's important.
Very cool. I just wanted to ask Matt, I didn't have another question, but so the talk that you gave today is at a Novus Ordo parish. They invited you here. They are working on, bringing in a traditional Latin Mass for some of those who want that. And then obviously they'll have the new Mass for those who go to the new Mass here. And so my question is, do you see that as something that most Novus Ordo parishes should entertain? And how were you received?
Today? Yes. Well, it's difficult to say what every parish should do, but I do think that every pastor should think seriously about introducing a traditional Latin Mass once a month, First Friday, First Saturday, or, on special occasions like a feast day for the parish. I know one priest, for example, who said, okay, every year now we're going to have a traditional high Mass on the feast of our parish patron, because this is the Mass that he celebrated, whichever patron it was, St. John Vianney or something like that. Right. So I think that it should be there, because it's very strange for Catholics to be living in a situation where they are literally cut off from almost 2,000 years of organic liturgical development. And it really is that. I mean, it depends on what aspect of the liturgy you're talking about. But there are things that Catholics are doing for 500 years, for 1,000 years, for 1,500 years that we're not doing anymore for the most part, that most Catholics are not doing. And it seems to me that they at least should try to develop the virtues, or at least the appreciation for what was it that, that so moved St. Padre Pio, or St. Therese of Lisieux, or St. Thomas Aquinas, or just countless saints you can mention, St. Edmund Campion, what is it that moved them? Why were they so gripped by this liturgy? What did they see in it? We should be able to see that too. I mean, just for the sake of continuity with our past. Right. So there's a kind of coherence of identity. So I think every parish should do something in this direction. And frankly, I mean, probably every parish has some people who are secretly longing for something like this, either because they know about it and they want to see it in their own parish instead of basically ditching their parish and going somewhere else across town, half an hour away. Because then it's that sort of contributes to the fragmentation of the Catholic world. Like basically now everybody's just shopping around for their favorite liturgy. And I understand that. I understand why we've gotten to that point. But wouldn't it be great if you could go to your neighborhood church and find there what some people have to drive an hour or more to get to? So yeah, I definitely think it's important.
So something that you were talking about there reminded me of a conversation I had with a friend of mine yesterday in preparation for this interview, and he is a big fan of yours, I guess you could say. He said he's read everything you've ever written. And so I asked him, I said, well, if you were going to be in my shoes, what would be a question you would want to ask Dr. Kwasniewski? And he said that over the past 5 years or so, he's seen a shift in your writing to where before you were seemed to have the mindset that the Novus Ordo is something that needed to be reformed, to where now you seem to shift more towards the Novus Ordo is something that needs to be overcome. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I would actually. And the reason is, my own personal journey, as everybody says nowadays, has been, it's taken a long time. I mean, I first started, trying to live a serious Catholic life over 30 years ago in high school. And that happened through the charismatic movement. And then I moved on from that to a more conservative sort of Latin Novus Ordo approach. And then I slowly discovered the traditional Mass, the low Mass, the high Mass, the pontifical Mass. So it was almost like every year there was a new discovery. And for a while I thought, the most important thing is to restore what people call the smells and bells. Like that's crucial. We have to get, the beautiful vestments, the beautiful chalices, the incense, the Gregorian chant, the Latin, the Ad Orientem. We have to get all that stuff there. And I still agree with that. And to that extent, I'm always in favor of anybody trying to reincorporate those elements of Catholic tradition because they're all meaningful in and of themselves and they're all beneficial. Anybody who sees a priest celebrating Ad Orientem knows that he's offering a sacrifice to God and he's not a facilitator of a community event. Okay. I'm always, in that sense, I support the reform of the reform. But what I came to see is that beyond the smells and bells, there are also what I've come to call genetic defects. That is to say, there are things that are kind of baked into the Novus Ordo that are very disturbing as you get to see them. And you realize that to reform all of those things out of it would require turning the whole thing inside out again, which the church doesn't really need because the church already has this very rich, ancient, developed prayer tradition. And so in a way, it's like almost like the mission impossible of reforming the reform or the ready-made liturgical heritage here that we should try to do as well as we can. And given those two options, that's why I'm always, that I go towards the one, not the other. Let me just give an example because I think this is important for people to hear. An example of what I mean by a genetic defect is, the editors who worked on the new missal and who worked on the orations, the opening prayer, the prayer of the gifts, the prayer after communion, or as they're technically called, the collect, the secret, the post-communion. The editors who worked on those things, they declared in writing that their editorial policy was to remove things that would be difficult for modern people and things that seemed too medieval and too penitential and too ascetical. So they removed every time the old prayers said something like, Lord, teach us to love the things of heaven and despise the things of earth. They expunged every one of those. There's not a trace of it left. Because they thought, this is, medieval negativity or whatever. But it's not. It's Christ saying, take up your cross and follow me, right. and don't get absorbed by the spirit of the world. It's all in the New Testament, and the liturgy transmitted that. And in the 60s, the 60s, it's like, this is not cool anymore, So.
Yeah. So on that note, actually, you were talking about, part of the music and the chanting, and you gave a speech on that as well, or a talk, I should say, and it was really enlightening. It for someone like me who wouldn't take the time to go to that depths of investigation or appreciation into the beauty of the chant and the way it's structured. It was very eye-opening for me, and it makes me appreciate it that much more. And so I guess 2 questions would be, how do you talk to somebody about that type of music or whatever, if they really maybe wouldn't care in the first place, if they're like, I really could care less, man. And then also a question would be that, do you think Jesus really cares if the new mass were singing one of the latest songs on the top Billboard Christian 100?
Yeah.
And if so, what damage is, or what could that lead to?
Yeah, no, I do think it's actually gravely important, these matters. I'll just tell a story. So I know a priest in Ireland who, the Irish, unfortunately, they have a tendency to rush through their liturgies. And this was the case in the old days, and it's still the case, almost even worse, because the Novus Ordo is simpler and it's in the vernacular. So they tend to rush through their mass and they don't sing the propers of the mass, and they don't, it's a kind of very stripped down liturgy. And of course, that together with the process of rapid secularization in that country has completely bled the church, so the mass attendance has just plummeted in Ireland, where it used to be like almost 100%, not even that long ago. And now it's, it's as bad as almost as bad as Western Europe. So this priest friend of mine, he celebrated a funeral mass, and in this mass, it was a Novus Ordo mass in English, but he chanted everything, and he chanted a bunch of the Kyrie and Sanctus. I think it was very simple. He himself usually does like a traditional high mass, but he did a simple sung chanted mass. And he said that afterwards, so many people came up to him and said, if this is what mass was like, we would come all the time. They just came for the funeral, because that's what you do. You go to funerals and weddings. But I think, and I've heard that from many priests, this is not just one, that is, Catholics, there's something about even a simply chanted mass that makes it seem so much deeper and so much more religious and so much more real. It's a real act. It's an act of encountering the mystery of God in a way that just reading a bunch of texts rapidly isn't ever going to seem. That's boring. That's the problem with that. And so I think that why Jesus cares is that he doesn't want people to be driven away from the mass by banality, by boredom, by cerebral textual rationalism. Nobody needs that. We don't need that. I don't go to church to learn. I go to church to worship. Amen. And if I'm going to learn something, I'm going to learn it kind of indirectly, like you absorb things. I find that a lot of what I learn indirectly. If I really want to study something, I'll go find a book and read it, or I'll go online and do a tutorial, but that's not what the mass is about. So that's why I think it's really important.
Yeah.
One of the things that you've mentioned on multiple occasions is just the beauty that's found in the traditional liturgy. And the more I learn about it, the more I recognize some of that beauty. But one of the things that that has caused me a little bit of hesitancy to really dive into this whole debate between, the extraordinary form and the ordinary form is, I feel like, in a sense, I'm wondering if we're falling into the same trap that the Pharisees and Sadducees of Jesus's time fell into, of focusing so much on the law that we forget the greatest commandments are to love. And I wonder if you see any, in your mind, if you see this whole conversation leading towards a greater unity in the church that would come out of this sort of division that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, no, those are some really, there are a bunch of questions, I think, and intertwined in what you just said. This much is clear to me, that the division that's in the church right now has multiple profound causes, and that the liturgy is just one of those causes. It may be the most noticeable or the most that cause the most friction. But I think what we're seeing, like with something like the Amazon Synod, right, which could be a whole separate conversation, there are so many bizarre and disturbing things that were said and done during the course of those weeks in Rome that, unity in the church right now is not going to be purchased cheaply. Unity right now is seriously threatened. It's threatened by the people who should be the guardians of unity. It's not threatened by the Catholics who want to have a reverent mass, or even by the Catholics who say, it's important for us to find the most reverent mass. They're not the ones causing the division. The ones who are causing the division are the ones who are saying, you know what, for hundreds of years or even thousands of years, Catholics thought these various things were extremely important, and now we don't think that's important. That causes division right there. It causes division from the church's own past, from her own theology, from her own devotional life. And in a way, it causes schizophrenia, like internal division, right? Like, who are we? What are we even doing? Like, do we even know what we're doing anymore? And are we adapting to the world? Are we accommodating to the world? Or are we trying to proclaim the gospel of Christ to the world so that it can be converted? Right. And so with all that confusion, I think unity is not going to be cheaply purchased. It's going to cost, blood, sweat, and tears. But to get to the other question that was kind of involved there about the Pharisees and Sadducees, I would go so far as to say every little detail in the old liturgy, the sort of things I was talking about today, like all the genuflections, all the kissing of the altar, all the bowings of the head at the name of Jesus, all the ceremonial, it's all an expression of love. It is about love. It's not about legality or legalism, because all of these practices developed long before there were rubrics and requirements. So it's people they thought to themselves, how can I express my worship and adoration and love of God as well as I possibly can? And they were spontaneously led to these things. And basically how the history of liturgy seems to have worked is some especially holy bishops started doing something extra, and everybody that heard about it said, that's a great idea, let's do it too. And then it just spread around, and we don't even know who it was. It was never legislated. It just happened. And only much later, in fact, for the first time, 1570 is the first time in the history of the church that a pope enforced universally a code of rubrics on the church. And the stuff that he enforced, almost all of it had been done for, since time immemorial, or at least certainly for longer than any living memory, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm saying is it is about love. Even the little details are about love. And our Lord himself, his attitude about the Pharisees and Sadducees is more subtle than a lot of people give him credit for. He says to them at one point, for example, you shouldn't stop tithing the mint and the cumin and the dill, but you should also do the bigger and more important things. That is to say, our Lord appreciated details too. He just didn't want people to have a confused notion of priorities, and certainly if there was somebody who was attending a liturgy just because they were all into the sort of swoosh of silk garments and everything, you'd say, okay, this person probably has some psychological issues. They're not there for the love of God. But if you have a love for God, and all the saints, you can see this, St. Philip Neri, St. Ignatius of Loyola, whoever they were, they wanted the best vestments, not because they were vain or fashion conscious, but because they thought God deserved it.
Right. I do have a follow-up question that you kind of touched a little bit on history of the church in that answer. And so a two-part question. First of all, when did, at what point in history did Latin become the, quote, official language of the Catholic liturgy?
Yes. 4th century. It was in the 4th century. And what seems to have happened, it's a very interesting story. Well, one of the things that's hard about the study of liturgy is that the records are very sketchy in the early centuries. When we first start getting detailed liturgical records, the liturgy is already quite developed. And just we either lost the manuscripts or things were not written down. They were just done by oral tradition and by things being, by example, sure. Which was, the way Gregorian chant was passed down for over 1,000 years was just by people memorizing it, by singing it over and over again. And I know that works because having done scholas for 30 years, there are a lot of chants I have memorized now. So, this doesn't require
nothing new to the Jewish faith.
Exactly. Very well. But what we know for sure is that the liturgy of the Church of Rome was originally in Greek, because Greek was the common language, Koine Greek. Every literate person spoke Greek. Right. And that was, the Roman Empire kind of came in on top of the Greek empire that was already culturally dominant. And you see this with all the Roman philosophers as well. They all, like Cicero, they're all studying Plato and Aristotle. The Romans basically have an inferiority complex towards the Greeks. And so they can't surpass them in philosophy and in rhetoric, but they can surpass them in administration and law and various other respects. So the liturgy was originally in Greek. And in the 4th century, it was translated by a decision of Pope St. Damasus I, and he was a pope at the same time as St. Jerome. But the decision wasn't, sometimes people say this, oh, well, then they were just, the reason why they were changing it is because they wanted to shift to the vernacular because, okay, people didn't speak Greek anymore. So they needed to shift to whatever the vernacular language was. That's just not true. The two reasons for the shift were, one, that the Latin, the customs in the Western Church and the theology had already developed enough in a different direction that they weren't really satisfied anymore doing liturgy in exactly the same way as it was being done in the Eastern sphere of the Roman Empire. But more than that, there was a big influx of Roman aristocrats and intellectuals into the church. And this is especially like after 313, after the Edict of Milan, when Christianity was legalized. And so there was a conscientious desire on the part of the Pope, it seems, to reach out to the intelligentsia and the elite, the cultural elite, and to put the Mass in a high level, high poetic register of Latin that actually bears many terms in common with Roman sacrificial religion in order to appeal to this new influx of the Roman sort of cream of the crop. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't done for sort of the hoi polloi, as it were. It was done actually it was done for the upper crust in a sense. And so what you see when you look at the Latin liturgy is not the vernacular vulgar Latin of the day, of which we have graffiti from ancient Rome. So we know the Latin that was spoken in the 4th century was almost on its way to being Italian, Mm-hmm. It was in a very high classical sort of Ciceronian style of Latin. And so even if you were in Rome in the 4th century and you heard the liturgy, it would have sounded like Elizabethan English does to us. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important point to bring out. It's not just vernacularization that took place.
The second part to that question is, what's the importance today in your mind of having a Mass in Latin rather than the vernacular where people can understand what's being said? Exactly.
Well, I mean, I think that there are multiple angles on that, but what I like to remind people that the Church in the 20th century, just as she most strongly reaffirmed the primacy of Gregorian chant, more than in any other century, even though it also almost disappeared, so too the Church reinforced Latin as the central language of the Roman Catholic Church more in the 20th century than ever before. And that was mainly two popes, Pius XI and John the 23rd, both of them, but also Pius XII, Pius X. I mean, there were a whole bunch of popes. So it's basically part of the ordinary universal magisterium of the Church that Latin is an appropriate language for the Catholic Church, not just for her liturgy, but also for her law, for her administration, for her theology. And the reasons were given by Pius XI, that Latin is an immutable language. So it's not constantly evolving the way that English is, right. Or any other contemporary language. It has a kind of fixity to it. And the meaning of it is very clear. I mean, that is to say, the words don't change anymore. The words that are in the Missal have been there for so many centuries, and we can translate them into a vernacular that changes with the times, but the prayers remain fixed. Yeah. And so they're this kind of beacon of doctrinal clarity and that we can look to. The second thing about it is that it's precisely not commonplace. So it's not a language of commerce. It's not a language of military empire. It's purely a language now of worship. Right. It's just become that over time. There was once upon a time when Latin was a language of scholarship. Now that's almost completely disappeared. So now it actually comes across as a kind of numinous language, like a language that's redolent with sacredness, And it's like you hear somebody say, Gloria in excelsis Deo. And it's like, wow, you know that you're at Mass, that right. something special is happening here. So it's like covering the language of the liturgy in gold and silver, like the way we want to have like a gold chalice rather than a wooden cup for Mass. Right. And the Latin is kind of like that gold chalice for the words of the Mass. And the other thing that Pope John the 23rd and Pius XI say is that Latin doesn't belong to any one people or culture or nation. It belongs to everybody, and in a sense, it belongs to nobody. And what's important about that is that, like, if you look at the status of English in the modern world, English is an international language of finance and commerce and tourism and so on. And imagine how insulting it would be if the liturgy were put everywhere into English, right? Because it would be like, oh, okay, well, this is just imperialism, cultural right. imperialism. But Latin is just the language of the Church. I mean, there's no Latin empire out there that's trying to like subjugate people into slavery or whatever. So it seems to me that it also then has that sense of like if an American and a Hispanic person and a German person and a Portuguese person, they all go to mass together and they hear if they hear any one of their own languages, it kind of excludes the other people.
Right.
But if they hear Latin, it embraces everybody and it transcends everybody as well.
Right. Because it's like our church we're universal, right? We're unified all over the globe. And so having that one common tongue unites us all.
Yes.
Right. Instead of having 4 different readings and 4 different languages.
Yeah, exactly.
Shared mass. Yeah. The one.
No, and it's, I mean, I will say this, anybody who's traveled around the world and gone to a Latin mass in a foreign country, you have the most incredible sense of, this is the same church everywhere. But unfortunately, I mean, I just have to say, whenever I've been to mass, like if I've been to mass in Italian in Italy or in French in France, I can understand basically what's going on because I've studied those languages a little bit, and the mass structure is fairly constant. But it definitely has a sense of like, this is their thing, it's not my thing. But when I go in those cities to a Latin mass, it's exactly the same thing, and that's like, it sends goosebumps up and down. You know, it's just it completely makes you feel like, wow, this really is a transnational, transcultural, transtemporal phenomenon. Yeah. The other thing I just want to throw in there is, I think it's really important for Catholics to take their own cultural heritage seriously. If we want to be, if we really believe that the Catholic Church was founded by the God-man, Jesus Christ, and this is not true of any other institution. I mean, maybe you could say something similar about the Greek Orthodox. We don't have to get into that right now, but it's, it's uniquely true that Christ, the Son of God, came to earth. He founded a church, and he, so to speak, unloaded into the church the riches of his Sacred Heart. Well, shouldn't we then take at least as much effort as like Jewish children to learn Hebrew or like Muslim children to learn classical Arabic? I mean, what is our problem? Like, why don't we make an effort?
Well, that was going to bring me to the question following up to that, is that, okay, so if you're taking your child, let's say, to a mass where they don't know the tongue, it's not familiar to them, then doesn't that almost in a sense make you have to work harder at catechesis for them, so that way you are telling them what is going on, as opposed to they're listening in English and they might not be listening, whatever. Right. And so it says, is that maybe part of the problem, where as we see some of the sad things that have happened recently in the church as a whole, of you cited the lack of the belief in the true presence, and people who support the contraceptions and all these things that aren't Catholic teaching, but yet for some reason the majority Catholic support. Do you think that part of it is because, whenever you're kind of are learning in your vernacular tongue, there's almost a sense of you don't have to be as involved really then in the formation of your child, because, hey, they can hear.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's very true. And I mean, it seems to me that we love the things that we work for hard, and the things that are handed to us on a platter, we have a certain contempt for them. Maybe it's the conventional wisdom about the pleasure of the chase, but I mean, it's really true that when you work hard for something and you own it and it becomes your own, then you value it.
You're right, Dad. You're right. You heard Dr. Kwasniewski just said it.
Well, and then let's go beyond that. I mean, of course, there's a problem with catechesis right now. We all know that. If you just look at some of the textbooks that dioceses are using, they're just pathetic. I mean, they hardly transmit any substantive content whatsoever, and it can often be very emotionally laden and kind of ambiguous. And I mean, there are all kinds of problems with catechesis. But the liturgy is the first and most basic catechizer. That's not its main function, but it actually does have that function. And so when people see, the priest and the ministers and everyone behaving with great reverence towards the Blessed Sacrament, I mean, it's unmistakable that they believe that this is something awesome, and this is something so special that you're going to act to it the way you would towards God. I mean, you're falling on your knees, in front of this over and over again. And then everybody's receiving communion on their knees, on the tongue. And you see this over and over, and the child picks that up. Children are very intuitive. They may not have the rational equipment to get into apologetics, but they intuit right away. People believe something here. Something special is going on here. And I don't care how many catechisms you throw at somebody, they will never learn it as well from a catechism as they do from getting on their knees and seeing everybody else get on their knees, right? So I think, this is really about transmitting the faith. It's not about, we have to get away from this idea that it's about verbal conceptual content. There are many things that are pre-verbal and pre-conceptual. like, let's just take a most basic example. The love that a baby receives from his mother or her mother in the mother's arms is, according to the psychiatrists, psychologists, that is the basis for a healthy self-image and like basically a healthy psyche for the rest of your life. You know, having that proper bond with the mother in infancy, that's all preconceptual and pre-rational, right? And so similarly, when you go to the Latin Mass, if you think of yourself as like a spiritual child of Holy Mother Church, and she's feeding you in all kinds of ways that are preconceptual and pre-rational, like seeing the priest facing eastwards, that's not a concept. That's not a text. That's a visible thing that you just see and intuit, or it shapes you just by seeing it. Am I making sense?
Yeah. One thing I would ask, because a lot of what you're saying to me in the form of the Latin Mass almost seems a little bit counterintuitive, because it seems like in the extraordinary form of the Mass, the laity are separate from what's taking place, and the priest is, as you mentioned in your talk, kind of over there doing something, and we're on this side just kind of watching. So in what way then are we really participating in what's going on in that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the extraordinary form really operates by paradox, one paradox after another. And you put your finger on one of them already, namely that it entices us to want to unite ourselves to what the priest is doing by deliberately pushing us off at a distance from what he's doing and making what he's doing seem very special, very cordoned off. It's something so awesome and so sacred that only the man with the anointed hands and with the sacramental character, you know, only he can do this. And yet by watching that, it sort of fascinates you. Like it's you can perceive the aura around it, and it's not, you know, that this is not something every day. And so it provokes you. It's provocative. It's meant to make you realize your place, and our place. What I mean by that is not like, oh, you're just a lowly layman and you'll never be equal to this great priest. It's not that at all. It's the Mass is supposed to be a participation and representation of the eternal wedding feast and the eternal worship going on with the angels and saints in heaven. And we're not there yet. None of us, you know, the priest, the people, nobody. And so the liturgy has various ways of reminding us that we are still separated from our final end, from our ultimate goal, which is the face-to-face vision of God in heaven. And yet it does so in such a way that rather than discouraging us, it encourages us to pray all the more that we'll reach that end, you know. So it does work very much by this paradox. That's true.
Do you think that it seems that part of our culture now, it's like we constantly need to be stimulated. We're looking at the computer, we're looking at our phone, we're looking at this, watching TV, and then all of a sudden we shut it off. Do you think that some of that has kind of crept into the way that the Mass also is done in the ordinary form, to where there seems to not be a whole lot of time for silence and or self-reflection, because we feel the need that maybe to keep the lay faithful stimulated, we need to make sure we have something going on.
Yes. Yeah, I do think that's a very unfortunate assumption that's been at work for decades now, long before we had computers and cell phones and things that make our attention spans even shorter and more frayed than they already are. It was already, you know, the idea was already being batted around in the 40s and 50s that maybe modern people are just not capable of understanding the liturgy anymore. Maybe they have to be kind of spoon-fed and told what to do and what to say. And I think, you know, again, as I said before, you want to assume the best intentions of people. So I assume, based on what these people wrote and that I've read, that what they thought they were doing was holding people by the hand and kind of like when you take a child to a museum, like an art museum, you have to kind of guide them around, like, oh, look, there's a Rembrandt painting, you know, like Rembrandt was this really famous Dutch painter and his works are priceless. And you just look at this, you know. So, but the problem is, if you make, I think Ratzinger says this, if you try to make everything explicit in the liturgy, you just kind of destroy it. It's like dissecting a frog and there's no frog left, you know?
Right.
And so you have to let something be there that is going to be almost like an obstacle that confronts you and says, holy, awesome ground, you know, come forward at the risk of your life, you know? and you start, when you hear the chant and you smell the incense and so on, it works on you in a very complex and subtle way. I think that's the wisdom of tradition, is that it doesn't try to hit you over the head with a lesson like Mother Goose or whatever. Like it wants to sort of entangle you in this mystery, this romance. And I think it's really true. It's very subtle and it's very true. And so there is a problem, which is that modern people are totally not ready for that. It's very sophisticated. It's like somebody says, "Oh, I need some beach reading." And you're like, "Oh, here's William Shakespeare," or here's Jane Austen. Well, actually Jane Austen, a lot of people like to read Jane Austen, even at the beach, I suppose. But it's very sophisticated. And yet all that it takes really, because this was also the mass attended by millions, by untold numbers of peasants and illiterate people, right? It's not about education. It's not about elite or anything. But what it takes is patience. You have to actually quiet down. Like, you have to be willing to sit down and do nothing and actually get to the point of discomfort. It's like when people start fasting, at first it just drives them crazy. They're so hungry. But everybody who's fasted knows that at a certain point you kind of break through and you get to a point where you stop feeling hungry. And I think similarly, with the liturgy, if you can just be patient enough to break through that threshold of like withdrawal symptoms from your smartphone or whatever, and break through, then you realize, oh, actually there's interiority in me. Like, I have this huge infinite world inside of me that I wasn't even aware of because I've been living on the surface all the time. And then there's the mystery of God, who's like an infinite ocean of being, with no end. Right. And you know what I mean? Like, you have to break through to that level. And I remember there was a spiritual master who said, if we're going to pray in a serious way, the first 10 minutes are just quieting down. Right. Yeah. And so if you're only going to pray if you don't give somebody enough silence, they'll never actually pray. They'll just maybe go through actions, go through motions, but they won't actually pray. So this is all important stuff.
Well, I know we're kind of near in time, so I figure Matt and I probably have maybe one more question apiece if you're willing to entice us.
Yeah, the last question I wanted to ask was for people like Kyle and I who recognize the traditional Mass as something that's worth trying to implement in more parishes, would you have any recommendations, things that we can do maybe that would kind of help move that ball forward?
Yes. I mean, of course, you have to be a good, prudent reader of situations. So, there might be a parish that is being that has Father Bob Boomer as the pastor or whatever. Yeah, and you're not going to get anywhere with him at all, because he's still into like having the first communion kids making banners and stuff. It's like that's the way. But if there's a parish where there's like a 25 or 30-year-old parochial vicar, and he's and the pastor likes him and is kind of letting him do his own thing to a certain extent, to approach somebody like that, chances are he's already been thinking about it. Maybe he's been reading about it, and would you be willing to do a Mass once a month, and see if that, so you always have to basically have to find the people who have an open heart and an open mind to Catholic tradition. And I'm sorry to say it, but it really does, with some exceptions, but it really does seem to fall on generational lines. Yeah. It's the people of our age and younger who have no baggage, and they just walk right into this and like, oh, that's cool. That's great. Let's do that. But in terms of like practical strategies, I mean, one thing that's very important, I think, is priests need to understand that the priest needs to be very cautious because of the climate in the church. There's so much internal persecution going on right now. I mean, it's sad to say, but it's just true. And so it's much better if lay people approach a priest, get to know him and be friendly towards him, like maybe one or two lay people, and broach these issues and then say, look, Father, I know that it's kind of a difficult time in the church, and, people get in trouble for starting the Latin Mass, as bizarre as that is. So what would you say if we got like a list of 100 signatures of people who would actually say in this petition, we are, respectfully asking Father so-and-so to begin doing an extraordinary form Mass at this parish. And the thing that and the reason that that's helpful is that then he can say to anybody who confronts him, oh, the people asked me for this.
Sure.
And in accordance with Summorum Pontificum, I just have to respond to what they're asking. So it doesn't look like he's imposing his vision and he's like trying to make everybody go back to the Inquisition in the Middle Ages or whatever. Right. But it looks more like, oh yeah, I'm just responding to a pastoral need, right? Sure. So it's good to be clever in that kind of way, right? Really to think about how to protect your priests as well as how to promote traditional things.
So Matt and I also we are parishioners at Novus Ordo Parish, and so we've got a lot of respect, a lot of friends, a lot of a good community there, people we really care about. And so having this conversation again is we don't want anyone to feel alienated, right? The fact that there has to be this your team versus my team, mm-hmm. and so I really want to try to negate that, like, and really just here is. What you said about, the Latin form, the extraordinary form, and here's some of the things going on in the new Mass. Well, if God's our number one mm-hmm. priority when we go to Mass, then let's discern prayerfully. So I guess I'm going to change the question I wanted to ask you. And if you don't have time to answer this and the time that we have left, I completely understand. But for people who say that when Jesus says the gates of hell will never prevail against my church, and then, so then we get into this back and forth between, well, the vitriol between the new Mass and the traditional Mass. And do you see like the hemorrhaging, it seems like in Europe, Germany especially, some of the problems going on in the church and some of the resurgence of the traditional form of the Mass, granted, probably not overwhelming, but comparatively it's growing, right? Mm-hmm. And like you said, with a lot of younger people coming up, do you see that as the fulfillment of Christ saying that the gates of hell won't prevail against my church, just seeing that kind of flux? Or?
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, one of the subjects that I find most fascinating is church history. And I read it a lot because there are a lot of lessons that we have to learn from church history. And one of them is that there is a pronounced ebb and flow of the presence of the church on the face of the earth, right? So in ancient times, the North African church was one of the most flourishing churches. Many, 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 many great saints came from North Africa, including St. Augustine. And that was completely wiped out by the Muslims. There's almost not a trace of Christianity anymore there. I mean, there is, but it's vestigial compared to what it was at the beginning when it was all Christian. And similarly, Asia Minor, right? Where I mean, like the cradle of Christianity in many ways, that was also taken over by the Muslims, right? And the Muslims are taking over lots of parts of Europe today. And they took over Spain for a long time until the Reconquest, came and the Christians booted them out. And so what's important to recognize is that Christ has promised that his church will never fail on the earth. That's what he said. He didn't say, my church is going to flourish in every country, in every land, every Episcopal conference is going to be just beautiful. And no, I mean, he never said anything like that. And in the Arian crisis, which, as you know, is, getting a lot of attention. It's like, there's a big focus on the fourth, right? But, the Arian crisis in the 4th century, when you read about that, it's absolutely harrowing to see the extent to which the Catholic faith became a minority religion. I mean, really a minority religion. I mean, among the bishops, it was a couple of % of the bishops who were staunchly Catholic at that time. The rest of them were either heretical or semi-heretical or cowardly, wouldn't speak out, or ambiguous. Would St. Ambrose be one of those bishops who was standing strong? He certainly did stand strong in terms of anti-Arianism, but it's more St. Athanasius mm-hmm. of Alexandria is the great figure there, the great hero, St. Hilary of Poitiers. So my point is, there's no guarantee that the local church is going to survive. There isn't. There's only the guarantee that the church will survive until the coming of Christ. And then we have these very kind of chilling words when Jesus says, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith left on the earth? He says that, right? And you're thinking, oh my goodness, that sounds really harrowing, doesn't it? Right. And so, I mean, I'm not saying we're in the end times. I'm definitely not making that claim, though we could be. You can't say definitively the opposite either. Right. But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith left on the earth? Sounds to me a lot like a really desperate situation, And in fact, the book of Revelation makes it very clear that as history comes to its end, the forces of good and evil become more and more starkly differentiated. And I think you can see that now with all of the insanity about transgender and sexual identity and homosexuality. And it's just in the past 10 years that this stuff has really exploded.
Right.
And it's exploding at a kind of, exponential,
Alarming rate.
just an alarming rate.
Indoctrinating the children and everything.
Exactly. And so that's happening now. And when we look at that, we have to start seeing the kind of things that we read about in the book of Revelation,
Yep.
the beast and all this stuff. And it's very, I'm not exaggerating. This is definitely happening. And we are here. God put us here right now because he loves us and he is empowering us to bear witness to Christ at this moment. It's such a privilege to be alive
Amen.
At this moment and to be a Catholic.
Amen. With that can of worms that you opened, I'm sure Matt and I would love to have you back again at some future time to discuss some of those types of topics. So thank you so much for your
You're welcome.
time. You were just
Thank you for having me.
such a great Catholic and an inspirational man. And thank you. And everybody listening, pray for Dr. Kwasniewski and the work that he does.
Absolutely. I just want to say, I don't think it's premature to say this will be our best episode ever. Because it was a lot less of Kyle and myself talking and a lot more of you. And it was beautiful just having the opportunity to sit down with you. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Y'all, hey, check us out. Pray your rosaries and be blessed.